Okay. Hi, all. Glad to be here today and really talking about this story about how you can use RiskLens and ServiceNow together to quantify your risk. And I'm very privileged to have Rob and Joe joining in from RiskLens. And I'll start by quickly introducing myself. I'm Utkarsh. I'm part of the product management team at ServiceNow, responsible for everything around risk. So all of the roadmap, strategy, and the feature development is what comes under my area of responsibility. I'll let Rob and Joe also quickly introduce themselves before we go on to the actual agenda.
Yeah, thank you so much, Utkarsh. Pleasure to see you all. My name is Joe Vink. I'm a director of sales here at RiskLens. So my responsibility within the business is managing a team that helps our customers operationalize the FAIR methodology and build quantitative cyber risk programs. So excited to chat a little bit more about our partnership with ServiceNow and how our customers use the two systems in parallel to quantify cyber risk. Rob, I'll hand it to you.
Yes, thanks, Joe. Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Esslinger. I'm a risk transformation advisor with RiskLens. My role is working with Joe and the rest of the RiskLens sales teams to help organizations understand how quantitative analysis can be introduced to their current risk management processes and gain additional value and insight into cyber risks and enterprise risks in general from a financial perspective.
Thanks, Rob and Joe. So it's a packed agenda today. We're going to do a bit of an introduction about the ServiceNow Risk Management solution. We'll also get to know the RiskLens solution and what they do. But majority of the time will be on the demo where we can demonstrate how RiskLens and ServiceNow can work better together, right? To provide the insights that customers are looking for to manage their risk effectively. And in case you have questions, you have comments, please feel free to post them on chat. We'll definitely take them up during logical points. Some housekeeping points. All of you will be automatically muted. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the sessions. The sessions will be recorded and shared on the ServiceNow community after the session. And after the session ends, you may be prompted to fill out a short survey. We really appreciate all of your feedback there. So you must have seen this from us, right? The world works with ServiceNow. That's our purpose. So we want to make the world work better for everyone in this org. So the vision within the risk BU is really to seamlessly embed risk and compliance into digital experiences and workflows so people and organizations can work better. So you'll see this happening across our portfolio of products, where we embed risk and compliance workflow into the first line use cases or workflows, and that reduces the friction that customers or users will generally have when managing their risk and compliance. So unlike other platforms, ServiceNow is actually born in the first line workflows. If you look at some of the key capabilities that are required in a risk management platform, it's really is around having a very comprehensive risk and control libraries, having a very strong risk assessment engine, managing your KRIs and KCIs, your internal and external risk events, issues, and finally reporting, right? So all of this is provided by ServiceNow. So within the ServiceNow application, you can manage your consolidated list of risk and controls. You can create the hierarchies of these. You can also associate risk to metrics as well as issues that helps you get visibility into what is happening in these risk and controls throughout the organization. Using the very advanced risk assessment engine, so you could associate risk assessments to pretty much anything in ServiceNow, right? So you can assess risk related to, let's say, IT assets. You can assess risk related to operational risk or vendor risk or any other type of risk. And when you do this, you can actually do a very comprehensive RCSA to do your inherent assessment, your control assessment, as well as your residual risk. Now, when you assess these risks, you are not just assessing it from a qualitative standpoint, but also a quantitative standpoint, or even a hybrid approach of both. So this is a very unique differentiator to ServiceNow platform, where we provide a very comprehensive risk assessment engine And the beauty of this engine is it could actually, within a single instance, cater to multiple risk assessment templates or methodologies you have in your organization. I'm going to do a deep dive into this in a moment, but just from a summary perspective, it helps us cater to not just one specific use case, but across the platform, multiple IRM use cases. Similarly, on the metrics side, we now have metrics, which helps us monitor your KRIs and KCIs, making sure all of your top risks are monitored more closely. And in case there's a change or there's early alerts, you could actually proactively take action on them. From your loss perspective or risk events from a more broader story perspective, it helps you manage your losses, make sure you're tracking them, you're using that information to identify control gaps, and strengthening your overall framework to make sure whatever risks are there, those are mitigated at a very low impact or let's say, less catastrophic manner. From an issue management perspective, you would see a very comprehensive capability to make sure all your control gaps are being plugged in, and these control gaps are now making sure the risk is further getting reduced. And finally, from a reporting perspective, it uses the Now Platform reporting engine to provide very holistic reports, as well as there are specific algorithms like some things like risk roll-up, or maybe some of the Basel reports that are available for our financial customers in the risk event module that helps you not just automate or digitize your workflow, but also helps you on the reporting side of things, making sure things are reported in the manner they are supposed to. So now one of the things you would see is what we don't do in the ServiceNow platform is quantitative analysis of a risk. While you can actually assess it or capture the quantitative output, but the entire quantitative analysis of it to understand, okay, what's the projection looking like, what the distribution is, and that's where RiskLens helps us do that. And we'll show this. So for all of you, just a reiteration of what a risk assessment is. So risk assessment is really a subset of your risk identification, your risk analysis, and risk evaluation put together. So as part of your RCSA exercise that customers do, they would identify a risk, they would assess the inherent, control, and residual risk, and then put in mitigating actions to say, okay, what should we do in order to manage this risk better? So this holistic picture gives you a clear visibility into what your risk assessment is. Now, in terms of the benefits from a qualitative analysis perspective, the first key benefit that I've seen customers get is really from a identification analysis perspective. A lot of times, this is your starting point when you're kickstarting, let's say, a new business or maybe a new initiative in your organization. You want to make sure whatever are your business objectives, you identify, document these risks across, and then actually to an extent, analyze them to say, okay, if there are existing controls in place, what those controls are, and then to an extent, assess them, right? Very qualitatively, you can assess the inherent assessment, you can assess the effectiveness of the controls, and then see where the residual risks are. It helps you filter the noise to make sure the risk that actually needs to be managed are managed well. And this really helps the organization keeps focus on in terms of the number of risks they are managing, right? So you don't want to spend all your effort in doing, let's say, quantitative analysis of all of your 1,000 risks, right? But you want to focus on those top 100 that you have in your organization, and you can actually analyze them better. The third bullet point is really around simplicity. So a lot of times when you're kickstarting your risk journey, and you want the employees to be able to do this assessment themselves, qualitative is much easier for the employees to do because they don't require extensive training. It's very, very communicative in nature. So they don't need any special skill set of it. And finally, even from a reporting standpoint, because when you're reporting it to senior management, a lot of times it starts with something like a heat map where you can plot these risks across, but obviously, senior management is always looking for the dollar losses, and that is where the data from RiskLens will help you club that across. So it's really a hybrid approach in terms of the reporting there. Now, doing a bit of a deep dive on the risk assessment, specifically the ARA. So if you look at it from a story perspective, this is what we cater to from an IRM perspective. So if you are an organization who is having multiple methodologies, depending on the context that you are assessing, right, ARA will help you do that. So you can assess multiple kinds of entities, which could be your business application, which could be a business process, lines of business, or a company, right? And you can do like a full-fledged RCSA exercise on each of these. But at the same time, if you want to understand how the impact is across, let's say, these business application to this business process, to the lines of business, to the company, system does a roll-up of these. Now, one unique factor is we just don't rely on manual assessment, but if there is data within ServiceNow or outside ServiceNow, you could also use something like automated assessment factors to actually automate and make sure these risk assessments are more continuous and they are not outdated. So this is where the unique differentiation of the ARA comes into picture, where it can provide you a very comprehensive risk assessment engine, which can help you cater to a variety of your risk assessment needs. So with that, I'll pass the ball to the RiskLens team to walk us through some of their journey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Utkarsh. Let me... Utkarsh, do you mind sharing your screen again, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. I appreciate the context and the background, Utkarsh. So to transition a little bit into maybe from a quantitative perspective, where RiskLens and a quantitative approach to risk management and specifically cyber risk management fits in, I think it's important to maybe zoom out and maybe start with, from a market standpoint and a problem standpoint, what is it that has even led to the formation of quantitative risk management as a discipline and an approach? And if we have to summarize sort of the main problem that clients look to solve for when they start quantifying cyber risk, it simply comes down to communication and decision making. And from a market standpoint, as I'm sure you've all witnessed, throughout your careers and your times in your various organizations, as the spotlight on cybersecurity has gotten significantly bigger over the last 5, 10, 15 years, what it's done is it's oftentimes changed the dynamics for CISOs and their teams. And this representation here is meant to showcase sort of the conversations and the partnerships that CISOs and the respective security teams would have with key partners throughout the business. And you'll notice a lot of the questions that these folks have are very difficult to answer in the traditional methodologies, right, or traditional ways, whether it's a high, medium, or low, or 1 through 5, or just in the technical jargon of a complex and dynamic world that is cybersecurity. And from a challenge standpoint, this is really the main thing that clients are looking to address. It's how can we foster better conversations with key stakeholders throughout the business to operate as good stewards of organizational resources and ultimately make better decisions so we can more cost effectively help the business understand the risk that they're exposed to, but then also more cost effectively allocate our security resources so that we can demonstrate the value of the work and the projects and the really just the vision that a particular security team may have or be implementing within their organization. So this is sort of the really the problem and the market conditions that have led to us even forming as a business and quantitative approach being formed as a discipline. Utkarsh, you mind stepping to the next slide so we can get into maybe the solution a bit? So these are our outputs from the platform mapped to common questions that we see clients wanting to answer. I'm going to start at the top left and just very briefly work my way through to show some examples of kind of the art of the possible. The first is, how much risk do we have? So very simply, within the context of either a very discrete scenario or across a large business unit, for example, or product line, we'd be able to answer the question, how much risk exists within a particular domain of an organization? One step over would be, what are our top risks? So either, again, across an entire enterprise, within a business unit, comparing business unit divisions to one another, we'd be able to showcase which risks are the most significant risks, so that we can not only communicate our understanding of these to various senior leaders, but also use it for prioritization, so that we can ensure the activities that we're taking, the projects we're funding, are only targeting the risks that matter most. On the top right, another use case that we see clients pursue is wanting to demonstrate risk trending, also compared to an appetite. So as the risk landscape is changing, right, as we're seeing new threats emerge, as we're implementing projects and completing new controls, for example, we'd be able to tell a story to various stakeholders about how we're seeing risk ebb and flow over time. And then on the bottom row, we see your types of losses. So when someone on the senior executive team says, okay, you're telling me there's a $10 million risk, what does that mean in practice? Would be able to very clearly articulate where those may come from, whether it's fines and judgments, whether it's lost productivity, whether it's lost revenue, lost customers, etc. Then the last two here are really focused around cost benefit and decision support. And if you have to sort of pinpoint this into core use cases, this is one of the more common use cases that we see clients pursue. It's how do we demonstrate control effectiveness and also measure the ROI of certain controls. So this is what can allow us to make trade-offs and make comparisons, and that we recognize you can't necessarily mitigate every single risk, and you definitely can't mitigate every single risk right now. So some level of trade-off has to happen in terms of what can we live with for the time being, and what risks, or what are the risks that we actually want to mitigate. Then the next level is, how much do we want to spend to mitigate those to an acceptable level? So rather than saying, let's take a red risk and make it an orange risk or a yellow risk, it's we've got a risk with a certain dollar amount. We want to spend $500,000 on a new project, and that's going to reduce our risk to a significantly lower amount. So that's the sort of narrative, all based on financial terms, that clients are looking to enable by leveraging quantitative risk management. Now, the last slide that I'll share, Uktarsh, if you don't mind stepping one slide forward, a very common question that we hear from organizations who are thinking about getting started is, where should we begin? It's, the concept of quantitative risk management resonates, but what are the first steps that we should take? To help answer this, what we've done is we've worked with our most successful clients, large Fortune 1000 type enterprises, and categorized the types of decisions that they use quantitative risk management to support into these three main categories. And that really, at its core, is the reason organizations quantify risk. It's more effective decision support. And I'll walk through each one of these briefly, just to give you some examples and some food for thought. The first are strategic decisions. So as the examples clearly outline here, these are things like reporting the top risks within the organization to senior leadership, board and audit committee, cyber steering committee, etc. And what we'll do is we'll see clients regularly update these sorts of dashboards, maybe on a quarterly basis, for example, to help showcase not only an understanding of the risks that matter most, but use that as a trending to show how those various categories of risk are changing over time. One level down from there is operational decisions. It's once we've got an understanding of the risks that matter most, we want to make some project trade-offs, for example. We want to do cost benefits to understand the value of the various cyber initiatives we have on an ongoing basis. We want to rationalize our cybersecurity budget, things like this. And then the last is tactical decisions. And I like to think of this as rapidly assessing the high volume of things that emerge in the day-to-day life of a security professional. So things like emerging threats that may pop up, audit findings, policy exceptions. And a good way to think about this is taking a thing of concern that may have just sort of arrived on your desk and wanting to understand, is this a 7-figure problem or is this a 4 or 5-figure problem? So these are the three types of decisions that we see clients really want to pursue by leveraging quantitative risk management. Most folks will say, we want to do all three. But from an engagement standpoint, what we'll typically do is within the context of your environment, the challenges that you're experiencing, the goals that you have, define goals based on sort of looking through these lenses, if you will, and then build sort of a project plan to support those goals. All right, Utkarsh, I will hand it back to you and step through the next phase of the webinar.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the wonderful introductions here and the overview on the risk lens side. If there are any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A window, and we'll definitely be happy to answer them. So with this, I would like to go into a system and first start with a bit of a demo on the ServiceNow side, and then we'll see how you could use the data in ServiceNow to actually do a quantitative analysis on the risk lens side. And for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to impersonate as an IT risk manager here. So I've already logged into the system. So I'm going to go into my workspace here. So you can see as an IT risk manager, I can look at the risk profile from multiple angles, from multiple standpoints. And what I've done for the demo today, I've already created a couple of risks, right? So one is around data breach, the other one is around ransomware, right? So as part of ServiceNow platform, what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to understand what the risk is, capture it fully. So you can capture the full details about this risk in terms of how this risk materializes for you, what the impacts are. So you can capture full description about this, tag it to a particular IT asset. So in this case, it's the business application, which is your ServiceNow ITSM business application. Make sure you have somebody owning this risk. So your risk owner. So in this case, I'm going to self-own this risk just for the simplicity of the demo, right? And tag it to a corresponding enterprise risk taxonomy so that when you do these risk assessments, they can all aggregate across the platform and provide from an enterprise risk perspective what the impact of these individual risk item is from a corporate standpoint, right? You could also relate to your controls. You can define a comprehensive set of library of controls. These controls can also come from some of the standard frameworks that you have, like ISO 27001 or NIST and others. And in fact, you could actually import them very easily through your UCF integration. So all of these controls can be imported across into the system, and then you can relate them to say, okay, if I have a data breach risk, these are the mitigating controls in place in order to actually mitigate that across, right? Along with it, you can also define your KRIs and KCIs. Now, in this case, this is, let's say, a new risk that I've just documented across in the system. We'll probably first assess this, then actually go through quantification, and only if it's a top risk, we may want to put in KRIs to actually manage this across. Now, in case there are any losses that are around this risk, those will appear here. So you can look at all the losses that you have incurred around this risk. Again, this is the data that can be used for quantification. So you can look at all the historical losses and how much money you have lost in order to actually manage this risk from a holistic perspective. The last is really the issues like I was talking about. So if there are any control gaps or if there are other foreseen issues around this risk that you want to proactively fix, you can define a comprehensive action plan on them. And you can say, this is how I'm planning to fix this. All of this actually is useful when you first assess this risk. So in this case here, I've already initiated an assessment, but essentially on click of a button, you can initiate an assessment here. Now in this case, I already have an assessment for me. So I can maybe cancel the current one and initiate a new one for you, right? So I'm just going to go there and do that. Let me pick up a different record. Yeah. So I can go assess this risk around. So I can say this is one of the risks around ransomware. Similarly, we have a risk around data breach. So I'm going to put myself as the risk owner, as the one who is initiating the assessment. The system initiates a task. So this is where it's a very simple to use user interface, where it's like a self-learning that your people in the first line can do. So it's not just the IT risk manager who can do this risk assessment, but it could be the actual application owner who has little to no knowledge about what risk is or what he's supposed to do, right? So that's a thought process behind it. It's really catered to that user, so it's a very guided experience. And I can see there's already an assessment that was done previously on this risk here. So the system asked me, do you want to copy over your previous assessment results? For the demo today, I'm going to say no, so that I can show you how it looks like for a new record. So now you see in the left-hand side, you have inherent assessment, you have your control assessment, you have your residual, and finally your risk response, right? So this is where you would assess the risk, assuming there are no controls in place. But in reality, there are definitely always controls in place, and you are going to assess them, which comes up your residual. Now, in case you want to further mitigate this risk, you can document what your response strategy is, if you are mitigating it or accepting it as it is. So that's also something you can drive. And then finally, as part of the response strategy, you can also identify net new controls in place. So we're going to look at this from an end-to-end workflow perspective, but let me start by doing a quick inherent assessment. And in this case here, you can see it's a very simple assessment of an impact and likelihood. So I can see what the different impact values are. Now, like I said, if you're typically as a first line user, you don't know what does insignificant mean or what does minor mean, right? So you can actually look at the complete your risk metrics to understand, okay, when I assess this risk from an impact standpoint, what are the different criteria I need to consider, right? So if I'm looking at it from a financial impact perspective, it should be less than $300,000, then I can classify this either as an insignificant or a minor, right? So this really helps the first line get that context in and make sure the rating they are providing is actually in line with what the organization expects it to be. So for now, I'm going to put both of them as catastrophic and almost certain. So let's say this is a ransomware as a risk. It has a catastrophic impact. And these days, it's almost certain that these kind of risks, assuming there are no controls in place, it will happen, right? So I do my inherent assessment. I can provide additional comments to justify why I've provided both the ratings. So you can provide factor level comments, or you could provide even overall comments here. And then I can move on to assess my controls. Now, before I do that, one of the key things you would observe is on the ARA platform, all of this is configurable. So whatever you're seeing on the UI can be completely changed depending on each of the client needs. So it means it's not just restricted to impact and likelihood as a factor. You can change it. You can say, I want to do, let's say, a deeper assessment of financial impact, reputational impact, client impact, or maybe I want to capture the actual losses that you're incurring instead of asking for a drop-down value. So this is what the power of the AR engine gives you, where you can actually configure your unique risk assessment template. And like I said, there are many ServiceNow customers who are using our ARA platform to do multi-facet risk assessment. So you can do a bottom-up or a top-down risk assessment. You can do a risk assessment from an IT perspective, which may be very different from an operational risk perspective. So that's why that focus has been on providing that power to you. And this really helps customers from a maturity journey perspective as well. So as you grow into your risk maturity, you should be able to reconfigure it without going back to, let's say an implementation vendor or a technical partner to actually reconfigure your entire risk assessment templates out. So that's the thought process behind giving that power to you, that flexibility to you to help you support the qualitative assessment of these risks. So once you are done with your inherent assessment, the system is going to move to your control assessment. Now I can see there are already two controls defined. One is around multi-factor authentication, and the other one is around the firewall, which is preventing it, right? Some of these attacks. I can look at the weighting of these controls, how much they are weighted, and then assess each of the control as well. So I can say, let's say maybe the firewall is proving somewhat ineffective, while the multi-factor authentication is probably partially effective, but can be improved, right? And now if you observe, this is where the system is auto-computing your residual risk to be high. So now this is a risk that I'm not comfortable with. But whenever I go to my senior stakeholders, like maybe somebody like a CFO or a CEO, and I say, this is a high risk. They may ask the question around, what does it mean, right, from a financial perspective? And that is where RiskLens will come in and they will help us answer that question, right? So defining that projected losses as well as the probability of those losses to get a more, I would say, mathematical judgment on them is where they will come and help us out in this area. But as part of the workflow, you can now define, this is definitely a place where I'm not comfortable with. So I want to define a further mitigation action to say, I want to mitigate this risk across. And this is where you can define your comprehensive mitigation plan. Now, again, from a cost benefit analysis perspective, if you are putting in additional measures or additional controls, the senior management may ask for justification as to why are we doing this, what the projection or the return on investment is, like Joe was talking about. So all of this can be then used with your RiskLens platform to understand that bit. So for now, I'm going to save it across, just a very simple dummy task, and initiate approval workflow. Now, in this case, I don't have approvers defined, but technically speaking, you can also do like a multi-level approval to make sure in case you want various stakeholders to sign off on this high risk, they review it, they provide their assessment on this, and this will make sure that, yes, this has been signed off by them. Now, once you do this, all you need to do is once your RiskLens integration is configured in the system, you need to go to that risk record here. So I'm going to go there and maybe open up this ransomware risk. And you can see in this case here, I have already requested a subscription on the RiskLens side. But if this was a new risk that does not have an active request that has been made on the RiskLens side, I would get an action saying subscribe to RiskLens. And then what the system will do automatically is it will share all of this data that we have around this risk with the RiskLens platform, where you can quantify this risk, right? Understand more about this risk. And once the quantification is complete, the outcome of this will be available to you to make further judgment or for the decisions around this risk. So the system provides you various metrics, and we'll see how we arrive at these metrics. But some of the key data points that you'll be able to get from the system is things like minimum loss exposure, most likely lost exposure, and average exposures, as well as the percentile. You're saying, okay, what the lower percentile is and what the corresponding value is and stuff like it. So this is where RiskLens really helps you quantify a subset of these risks. Now, it can happen, like I was saying, there are multiple of these risks that I have within my entity, which is ServiceNow ITSM, but I don't want to quantify all of them. Maybe I just want to quantify the top ones, the ones where I have a high risk. So you can just selectively initiate a quantitative request for them here, right? Now, once the request is raised, what you will also be able to do is you'll be able to track these requests. So what I can go is I can look at all the requests that I have made from the ServiceNow platform in this view here. So I can see these are the different risks that I have requested from the RiskLens side and the status of these requests. So they are still pending. So the data has not yet come. But once the RiskLens side, the analysis is completed, you will see the status getting updated and the data getting updated into the risk fields that we have. We can then use the ServiceNow reporting engine to again report back this data and use it for further decision making, right? So this is where you can track your request. In case you already have, let's say, a request that was made previously, the system also tracks all the requests that were made in the past. So you can look at, okay, what was the risk and what the loss exposure were, what the percentile values were. So it just not track your current request, but all of your historical data as well, right? And integrating it is like literally like 5 minutes, right? So I actually did this today morning, for example. You just need to have a client ID and a client token to say, okay, what my ID and token is, and that's the API-based integration we offer with the RiskLens. So it's a very simple self-configuration that anybody little knowledge on how things work technically can actually do in the system, right? So that's the main advantage behind this corresponding piece here. So with that, I'll hand it over to the RiskLens team to walk us through how the magic is happening on the RiskLens side. Rob?
Yes, thank you, Tarsh. Appreciate it. So let me jump into the RiskLens platform here, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail in regards to that quantitative analysis that takes place and how those outputs are ultimately used to support decision-making within our organization. So the example that I will walk through today is around that data breach risk that Utkarsh had shown within ServiceNow. So when you subscribe to the RiskLens platform, the details about the assessment get pushed across to RiskLens to enable us to start that quantitative analysis process. You can see the risk identifier here from ServiceNow, as well as information regarding the purpose behind this assessment. I'm going to go ahead and click into this. And what we can see from the description of this purpose here is we're concerned with sensitive data of some type being accessed in an unauthorized fashion. That could be PII data, it could be PHI data, it might be PCI regulated data. And in many organizations, there are different systems and applications that store and or process these different types of information. So when we think in the context of data breach as a risk, really what we want to understand is how and where that data is being stored and processed within our environment and how well that information is being protected across those systems. And more often than not, that leads to the identification of more than one loss event associated with this particular risk. So through a scoping exercise, that follows common risk management frameworks, the RiskLens platform guides us through the process of identifying the various loss events that are associated with this particular risk, quantifying using a data-driven approach to understand not only the probability that that loss event may occur, but the impact of that event in financial terms. How much will it cost when a certain number and a certain type of records are breached within a given system? So the scope of our data breach assessment includes a number of different loss event scenarios that have been identified in terms of systems that, again, store this sensitive information, the various threats that they may be exposed to. And what our platform is enabling us to do is discretely measure the risk associated with each of these scenarios, and then give an aggregate picture of that total risk. So the total risk associated with data breach in terms of our environment. And this is the data set that automatically synchronizes back to the risk registry entry within the ServiceNow platform. So having an understanding of our total risk helps drive decision-making and prioritization in terms of which risks within our organization should we be focusing resources on. Utkarsh mentioned ransomware. We would have similar qualitative or quantitative metrics to drive our risk exposure according to ransomware. And depending on the financial impact and probability of those events, that can help us to make a determination on whether to prioritize ransomware mitigation or data breach mitigations from a security initiative standpoint. Now, the top risks tab here is now able to allow us to drill into the specific details of each of those loss event scenarios. So what makes up that total risk concerning data breach within our organization? And we have 3 metrics that can inform our decision-making process in terms of the prioritization and identification of where and how we're carrying risk as it pertains to data breach. The per event loss magnitude metric tells us the amount of loss, the impact, overall impact attributed to each one of these individual scenarios. When it happens, how much is it going to cost our business? In the middle, we have the probability that each of those loss events will take place. And we find that it's often valuable to put this in the context of a number. A lot of organizations have identified various thresholds from the perspective of where loss becomes meaningful. So not only can we report on the specific probability of each loss event, we can report the probability of exceeding some meaningful number within the organization. So in this case, I have it set to $5 million. And this is the probability that each of these loss events not only would occur, but occur and exceed that $5 million threshold. And then finally, the annualized loss exposure. This is the normalization of the per event impact and the probability of loss. It really helps us from a prioritization standpoint because, again, it normalizes black swan events, for example, that may have a very, very large impact, but a very, very low probability. We won't lose sight of other types of risks that maybe have a much smaller impact, but because of their frequency, may end up hurting us more in the long run. So this annualized loss exposure is very helpful, again, from that prioritization standpoint, because it's normalizing the first two metrics. But ultimately, having all three of these data points is very, very helpful in terms of driving our decision-making in terms of how we're going to prioritize risk mitigation. In this particular example, it's very obvious which of these particular loss events is contributing most to this loss exposure. This mobile app breach scenario is really the lion's share of the annualized loss exposure. It has the largest per event loss exposure, and it has the highest probability of occurring. And this is not unusual for us to see in a lot of environments where things like data breach, obviously, the loss of sensitive data is very top of mind for a lot of organizations. It often does not require a lot of justification on how and where you should be protecting and allocating resources to protect that data. But in some cases, we may find gaps in our controls and gaps in our policies. That may be something that's raised as an issue within your ServiceNow instance. What quantitative or quantitative analysis can do is help us understand what those gaps mean in terms of financial exposure, how they compare to other systems that may not have those same control gaps, and ultimately, again, supports that decision-making process on how to target those control gap, closing those control gaps. So the next sort of component of this analysis is what to do about how do we mitigate this data breach risk if the overall number is higher than we're comfortable with. In this case, we can hone in here on this mobile app breach scenario. If we can reduce this particular risk, that's going to really get the overall data breach risk under control. And that's where our cost benefit analysis really comes into play, helping us to understand from not only a collective data breach perspective, but help understand what a specific control change might do in terms of risk reduction. So I have an example associated with this data breach, a mitigation report that is essentially taking the same scope of assessment as a baseline and enabling us to attribute possible control changes, maybe improving encryption on our back end. Maybe this is a control gap that was shown to be ineffective in the realm of our data breach systems. Maybe improving controls around the front end of these systems would ultimately lead to a reduction in risk. But often the question is, how much value are we really getting from these controls? Are they effective in reducing risk? Is the risk reduction we get from that control proportionate to the spend on that control? So having risk expressed in financial terms really is powerful in informing that decision-making process, which control best mitigates risk, very tangible metric to show how much less loss we would have by implementing a particular control, but also because we're expressing that risk reduction in financial terms, we can directly compare it to the cost of implementation for those controls and have a very tangible ROI to help understand the value we're achieving by implementing this particular control in question. So this cost benefit report shows us the initial baseline. This is the current risk based on current controls, often referred to as residual risk in the context of GRC platforms like ServiceNow. And these additional assessments are future state residual risk positions, where if we were to improve encryption, specifically on the mobile app solution, how much less risk would we have overall from data breach? If we deployed an application firewall, say something dedicated to the front end of that mobile application, again, how much less risk would we have? But the simple sort of effectiveness of the control, again, isn't always the full story. The most risk reduction isn't always the best option for a control. There's other factors that come into play, such as the cost and the time to implement certain controls. And we may find that the preferred option, in this case, improving the encryption, it may be out of reach for the organization at this time based on how long it would take to implement that change and the cost associated with it. So it's very powerful to be able to suggest additional compensating controls, show the effectiveness, show the ROI associated with those, and help the business to understand what they can do in the short term as they plan for the more effective long-term solutions. And then further, just to illustrate the concept of targeting specific areas of loss, we can actually drill down on each of the treatment options to show the effectiveness in each of the scenarios in question within this context of data breach. And as I mentioned, we specifically honed in on the mobile app breach and simply looked at deploying a very targeted mitigation for this one losses scenario involving this one particular application, and showed that we can drop the annualized loss exposure significantly. All of these other losses are fairly well managed within tolerance. We don't need to spend extra money or resources to apply controls there. We can be very targeted in terms of how and where we want to allocate those limited resources and ensure that we're getting the best bang for the buck. So with that, we are approaching the 10 minutes to the top of the hour. So I'd like to turn it back over to Utkarsh and have some Q&A time.
Thanks, Rob, for the wonderful demo. Definitely a lot of good insights that customers always look for, right? Trying to justify the cost. And like you said, how do we enable what controls should we implement first and what controls to implement later? So I see a bunch of questions in the Q&A chat, and I'm going to start by the first question from Aaron, which is around, we want to focus on a residual assessment and 10 of the inherent assessment. Is that possible? Absolutely, Aaron. In the ServiceNow platform, like I said, we offer you a very configurable workflow engine in the ARA platform. So you can say, I only want to do residual assessment, or I only want to do inherent assessment. So that's all part of the risk assessment methodology, where you turn things or turn off things. And the beauty of this is you can turn this on. Let's say you for IT risk assessment, you can just do residual risk assessment. But for operational risk, let's say I want to do all three, which is inherent, control, residual. So you can actually configure that too in the same platform. The second question is around, you may still address this, but are there programmatical API methods to pull data into RiskLens? So we already offer an API where all of the information from ServiceNow is shared to RiskLens. Things like the risk details, the entity, where the context of the risk is being shared to RiskLens team. And I know we have been working together to identify how more information, things like, let's say, risk events, or maybe the control performance in ServiceNow can be shared with RiskLens. Rob, Joe, anything you would like to add on this?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. There is a full API stack available within the RiskLens platform to pull data in across a variety of the components, whether it's the data inputs to support the analysis, the ability to export the reporting outputs to other systems. So we have customers, that have additional reporting engines that they like to utilize, things like Tableau, for example. So yes, there's an API that exposes all of that data for both import and export of data.
Awesome. There's also a question around the mitigation task or the mitigation plan. Can you also add mitigation task to the mitigation plan to be able to follow up on all open mitigation tasks related to risk. So right now, the mitigation plan we have is a single task, but a lot of customers using the configurability of the ServiceNow platform can actually enable multiple tasks. And I've seen multiple customers do this. From a roadmap standpoint, there are plans to enable like a full-fledged planning workflow there. And that's where we are also going to connect to our SPM application, where such a mitigation plan can be created as a demand or maybe as an initiative, and you want to manage it as a project. So there's also better together between the two applications we are looking at. So there's going to be definitely investment in the roadmap to fix some of these things and enhance the entire experience around how we are doing your mitigation planning there. So there's also a question from Surya around how configurable is the risk scoring? Can we use mathematical models like mean, median, etc.? I'm assuming it's on the ServiceNow side again, and it's definitely very configurable. So you're not just restricted to say impact times likelihood. You can have your own custom formula as long as that is supported in the JavaScript. So as a tool or as a mathematical function, you can use any of those functions to define your own custom formula, and the system will be able to take that along and be able to compute your risk scores there. The next question is from Mario regarding the subscribe to RiskLens function. And it talks about, does this provide information from our own instance of RiskLens, or does this provide information from RiskLens itself with industry information regarding risk? So what we are doing is, Mario, when you say subscribe to RiskLens, effectively you are making a request saying, I need a quantitative analysis of this particular risk, which needs to be done in the RiskLens platform. And once you take that action, as you were seeing, you can see that that action name turns to subscribe to RiskLens, which means there's a subscription, there's an analysis is ongoing in the RiskLens side. And this is the unique analysis for your organization, right? So yeah, I know in RiskLens you can also compare, but I'll let Joe and Rob comment on what we do in terms of making sure we can bring in some of the industry best practices when you're doing the quantification there on the RiskLens side.
So yes, Mario. So when you subscribe to RiskLens, essentially it is creating a risk assessment for you within the RiskLens platform that's linked to the risk registry within ServiceNow. And so once you're at that stage, you can absolutely utilize past assessment scenarios that you've done to scope into that assessment, as well as add any additional loss event scenarios that may be relevant to that particular risk. And once you run that assessment and set it to its current state, those results will be funneled back automatically into ServiceNow. Additionally, in the future, if you create additional versions, iterations on the timeline for those risk assessments, the most recent current data will automatically sync back and keep the ServiceNow instance up to date.
Thanks, Rob. There's also a question from Imran. Does the RiskLens integration work with advanced risk application? Absolutely, Imran. You can use the RiskLens integration with classic risk or advanced risk. So the key point is it is integrated with your risk object, which remains the same across your classic risk and advanced risk. So there's no reason you should not be able to use that there. There's also a question from Saurabh, and maybe Rob, you can take this one. How does RiskLens determine the dollar figures for a specific organization? Is it benchmarked to industry in general?
Yeah, it's both. There's a combination of industry benchmark data available within the platform, but you're also able to model your own organizationally specific data. So in our data breach example, the metric that drives the analysis process is the number of sensitive records that would be exposed in a breach event, and then the type of records, whether it's PII, PCI, PHI. You specify that as a component of the analysis. It's actually attributed to the asset that information is stored on, and then in RiskLens packages in the form of loss tables, libraries of data regarding past breach events and how much organizations paid out in terms of regulatory fines, other types of judgments from possible civil suits, incident response and disclosure costs, even losses associated with providing credit monitoring to those individuals whose records were breached. That's all packaged in the platform. So it's sort of that combination of your own information with the RiskLens industry data that produces those quantifiable outputs.
Awesome. And there's a last question from Surya. Is there any specific license model for buying in RiskLens? So Surya, if your question is more from ServiceNow perspective, as long as you are a customer of ServiceNow IRM application, you should be able to use the RiskLens. It's not tied to any standard professional or enterprise license, but definitely it's an extra license that you will have to purchase on the RiskLens side. And I'll let Joe and Rob comment on it.
Yeah, Utkarsh, you hit the highlights in terms of, of course, there's a separate licensing license that's required to leverage RiskLens and use the two systems in tandem. We can, of course, speak one-on-one, or feel free to reach out if you'd like to explore it in more depth. But just to briefly describe the licensing model, it's essentially modular based. So as I'm sure you've seen with other technology providers out there, there's modules of functionality that are mapped to use cases and the types of decisions that you may use RiskLens to pursue. And we would just license the appropriate modules based on the goals that you have for your particular use case and in your particular program.
Thanks, Joe. And one last question again from Rohit. How different is RiskLens from Monte Carlo simulation or differentiator? As I assume, both are capable of doing cost-benefit analysis, RCA, and much more. Would be good to understand more on this. So Rob or Joe, do you want to take this up?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it, and Rob, fill in any gaps if there are any. I mean, Monte Carlo simulation's a mathematical capability. RiskLens is a technology platform that leverages Monte Carlo to run the analysis and really manage the data, generate the reporting that you would need to operationalize a quantitative risk management program. So I would say those are the primary differences. Is RiskLens an enterprise technology platform. Monte Carlo is a mathematical technique that we leverage as one capability within the platform.
Thanks, Joe. And I see no further questions and right on time. So thank you everyone for your time. Thanks Rob and Joe for your time today and walking us through the wonderful RiskLens application. Really glad to be here today and spending time with you all.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you all.